"This is a dead orchard held by a man who can no longer keep it," the CEO said, loud enough for the whole county hearing to hear. "Take the check, Mr. Brandt, before I stop offering." Everyone heard what she really meant. Broke old man, dead orchard, move aside. A few people in the room actually laughed. Eli Brandt did not. He just folded his rough hands on the table and waited because he knew something the most powerful woman in the valley did not. That crooked old tree she wanted to bulldoze was not dead. It was the reason her $40 million company had been hiding a failure no one in that hearing room was ever supposed to know about. And before the week was over, the same people who laughed would be standing over a crate of young trees, reading his name twice. Stay with this one, because the room that laughed first was not laughing by the end. Eli Brandt was a widower, and by any number the bank could find, he was finished. His wife, Sarah, had grown up on that hillside. Her grandfather, a man named Amos, had spent 40 years breeding one impossible apple by hand, the Cold Harbor Pippin, a variety no nursery on earth still carried. When Sarah died, the letters started coming with the numbers circled in red. His 9-year-old daughter, Wren, had asked him one winter night if they were going to lose Mom's trees. He had told her no. He had been holding that line ever since, quietly, while the whole valley called him the stubborn man who should have sold years ago. Then Varanth came. Diane Okafor's company was paving the valley for a distribution hub, and Eli's hillside was the last parcel in the way, with a county vote 3 days out. Her people had already come twice with numbers on paper. Both times Eli had said the orchard was not for sale and gone back to his fence. So this time Diane did not send her people. She came to finish it herself in public at the hearing, where a stubborn man's pride would have nowhere left to hide. Eli came to the county hearing to speak for his land. He wore his good shirt, the one Sarah had ironed a lifetime ago, and he stood when they called his name. He got about 2 sentences in, something about the trees being older than the county road, before Diane cut him off. "With respect," she said, not meaning any, "sentiment is not a business plan. This is a non-performing asset held by an owner who can no longer maintain it." It was the polite version, and the room heard the other one anyway. That was when a few people laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the sound of a room that had already decided he was small. Eli looked back once toward the door, where Wren was standing on her toes to see her father. Then she stopped standing on her toes and just held the doorframe with both hands. For 1 second his jaw tightened. He thought about the letter still on the kitchen table and how much that check would fix. He thought about Wren sleeping without the red envelopes. Then he thought about the promise and he let the money go. He sat down, folded his hands and said only, "Before you vote to bury something, you might want to learn whether it's dead." Diane smiled like the meeting was already over. "I've seen the survey," she said. "There's nothing up there but old wood." Eli reached into the paper bag he had carried in and set one apple on the table. No one spoke at first. Then Diane's lab director, there to present Varanth's plan, leaned forward from 2 seats down her own row, and the color left his face before the words left his mouth. "That's the Cold Harbor," he said. Diane turned toward him too fast. "Don't," he said quietly. And that was when the whole room understood the apple mattered. Because 2 years earlier, Varanth had staked a whole premium brand on reviving a lost heritage apple. They had hired agronomists, built a climate lab, spent a fortune, and failed. Every graft died. The one variety they wanted most simply would not come back, and Diane had signed off on burying the project. Its name was the Cold Harbor Pippin, and it was sitting on the table in front of the entire county board, grown by the failing man she had just mocked. The room that had laughed went quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that starts with the people who understand first and spreads outward until no one is smiling. Diane looked toward the board chair, but he was not watching her anymore. He was watching the apple. So was everyone else. Diane reached for the folder in front of her, but no one was looking at the paperwork anymore. Not the board, not the press, not even her own lab director. Wren was still holding the doorframe, only now she was standing tall again. Diane asked for a recess. The board chair granted it, and when he did, he was looking at the apple, not at her. She did not get her vote that day. By morning, the photo of one apple on a government table had reached Verant's own board, and two of them called Diane with a single question. Was it true that the variety their brand had failed to grow was alive on the land they were about to pave? For the first time in the whole deal, Diane Okafor was the one being asked to explain herself. 3 days later, the black Range Rover came up Eli's gravel road, and this time she was not the only one who came. Her lab director came. So did the woman from the regional paper who had sat in the back of the hearing. They climbed the hill together, Diane's expensive shoes turning in the soft ground, up to the crooked old tree, and to the 3 rows of young trees below it that no one at Verant had believed could exist. Eli explained it plainly. The lab had used frozen wood. Amos's notebook said the Cold Harbor would refuse it. He had cut living wood in the one narrow week before the sap rose, and failed 17 times before a single bud held. No lab, no funding. Just a widower, a notebook, and a promise to a little girl. The lab director looked at the young trees the way a person looks at something they were told was impossible. Then he looked at Diane, and he did not have to say it out loud. The man they had called a failure had done what her entire company could not. Diane opened her mouth once, then closed it. For the first time since the hearing, she understood that any sentence she said could become tomorrow's headline. And this time, there was a reporter standing close enough to write down every word. Diane finally asked the question she had not asked at the hearing. She asked how much he wanted. Eli looked at her, and then at the tree, and then back at her. "You stood up in that room," he said, "and told everyone I was finished." He was quiet for a moment. "You were looking at the only thing in this valley that wasn't." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. Behind him, 3 rows of trees that were never supposed to live moved a little in the wind. Diane looked at the young trees, then at Eli. For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind moving through the rows she had tried to erase. "I was wrong about your orchard," she said. Then quieter, because the reporter was close enough to hear it anyway, "and I was wrong about you." Verant never built its hub on the hillside. The parcel request was withdrawn, in writing, and the regional paper ran the story with a photo of the old tree, and one line Diane was quoted saying on the record, that the most valuable thing in the valley had almost been paved over by people who never bothered to look up the hill. Eli kept the hill. Verant only ever licensed the cuttings, and the premium brand that had died in a lab launched a year later carrying the line Diane signed herself. Preserved from the Brandt orchard, from the work of Amos, Sarah, Eli, and Wren. At the county fair that fall, the same board members who had laughed at the hearing stopped at a crate of young trees and read that name. One of them started to say something, then thought better of it. There was nothing clever left to say. The stubborn man the valley had written off was suddenly the one people drove in from 3 counties to meet. Wren watched the board members from across the aisle. She did not gloat, and she did not need to. She just touched the first tag, the one she had written herself, and smiled like a daughter who had waited a long time for the world to learn how to read her father's name. Eli Brandt never raised his voice, and he never took revenge. He just refused to sell the one thing that could not be replaced, and let the truth do to them what he never would. So tell me honestly, would you have taken the check, or made them come back up the hill and read your name twice? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe to The Overlooked Father. For the quiet ones the world almost laughed out of the room.